You are a woman in the year 1830, standing in the grey morning light of a Yorkshire market square. The cobblestones beneath your worn boots are slick with frost, your breath curling into small clouds in the cold air. Around you, voices murmur and grow louder, not with joy, but with something sharper, something that makes your stomach twist with dread and desperate hope all at once. Rough rope scratches against the skin of your neck, the halter tied there no different from the ones used on cattle. At the other end, your husband's calloused hand grips firm, his voice carrying over the crowd like a tradesman hawking livestock. "What am I bid for this fine woman?" he shouts, words blurred by the ale he swallowed at dawn to steady his nerves. Strong back, good teeth, can cook and mend. Faces press closer, some curious, some scornful, some calculating. A few men step forward, studying you as if you were a mare on show, checking your hands for calluses that prove your work, glancing at your face to judge if you're comely enough to warm a bed. Your heart hammers in your chest. In only moments, your life will change forever. You might end up with a gentler man than the one who dragged you here, or perhaps someone far worse. What unsettles you most is this: it isn't a crime, it isn't madness. It is, in the twisted logic of your time, your best chance at freedom, your only chance at divorce. Before we descend into these buried histories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of the past, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more. And please leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I find it incredible that, across oceans and centuries, we're piecing together these forgotten stories side by side. The grim ritual we call wife-selling was not born from cruelty alone, though cruelty ran through it. It came out of a legal system so rigid, so unforgiving, that it left the poor no other path. To understand why Victorian men dragged wives to market squares with halters tied around their necks, we have to enter a world where women were not people, they were property. In Victorian England, the legal doctrine of coverture meant that once a woman married, her very identity was swallowed up by her husband's. As Sir William Blackstone wrote in 1753, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. She became what the law called a femme covert, covered, concealed beneath her husband's legal shadow, erased like ink under a darker stain. Picture Mary Thompson, a fictional, but typical working-class woman of the 1820s. Before marriage, she could own land, sign contracts, even sue in court. But the instant she took her vows, all that vanished. Her wages belonged to her husband. Any inheritance flowed into his pocket. If she ran a bread stall or washed linen for coin, every penny was legally his. Even her dress, the very clothes on her back, belonged not to her, but to him. If William, her husband, beat her until she collapsed, the law barely stirred. A man had the right to correct his wife just as he might discipline a child or train a dog. If he drank away the rent or gambled their food, she had no legal complaint. If he came home with diseases or refused to work while she scrubbed laundry until her fingers bled, the law stood with him, not her. But what happened when Mary could take no more? When William's correction cracked her ribs? When his drinking left their children hungry night after night? What if she met another, a kind widower who treated her with respect, or a bachelor who offered real affection? For the wealthy, divorce was possible. But before 1857, it required a private act of Parliament, a process costing at least £1,000. The practice likely began in the late 1600s, a desperate invention wrapped in folk belief. If women were property in the eyes of the law, then why not transfer them like any other? A ritual emerged, part humiliation, part grim parody of divorce and remarriage. The sale often began with a newspaper notice, written like a livestock ad. John Smith will sell his wife Mary at Doncaster Market on Tuesday next. She is healthy, strong, and of good character. No reasonable offer refused. Others were harsher. Thomas Brown, being tired of his wife, will dispose of her to any person willing to take her off his hands. On the appointed day, the husband led her to the market square, halter fixed round her neck, arm, or waist rope most often, but sometimes ribbon in a pitiful stab at dignity. It marked her as property, no different from a cow or sheep. The husband, acting as auctioneer, called out, "What am I offered for this woman? 26 years old, fit to bear children, skilled with a needle, fine teeth." Men leaned in, peering at her hands, studying her face, even demanding she speak so they might test her manners. Yet here lies a crucial truth. In many cases, the sale was prearranged. The buyer was often her lover, and the auction became a twisted form of consensual divorce. Humiliating, yes, but giving all three parties what the law denied: separation, remarriage, and community acknowledgement. In Brighton, 1826. A man sold his wife for £5 to a sailor. A newspaper noted she seemed nothing loath to go, and the whole affair carried out with good humor. The sailor had likely courted her for months, and the sale gave them legitimacy. In another case in Rock Market, 1830, a wife sold for 2 shillings and 6 pence insisted the deal continued despite her husband's wavering. "Let be, you rogue," she snapped. "I will be sold, I want to change." Her voice still cuts sharp across the years, defiant, fierce. Grasping at the only agency the law allowed her, prices varied wildly, as much as £100 plus £25 per child, worth tens of thousands today, or as little as a glass of ale. But the money mattered less than the performance. What counted was the public witness. The halter passed from one man to another, sealing the transfer. Sometimes written bills of sale mimicked real property deeds, complete with signatures and formal wording. Feasts followed in nearby pubs. Bells rang. Crowds gathered, hundreds, sometimes treating it as theater, trial, carnival all at once. But not all sales were consensual. Some women were sold like true livestock, their fates decided by the highest stranger. In 1766, a Southwark carpenter drunkenly sold his wife in an alehouse. When he sobered and begged her back, she refused. The rope became his final escape. In Manchester, 1824, a wife was sold for 5 shillings, refused her buyer, and was auctioned again for 3 shillings and ale. Women sometimes could refuse, but imagine the terror of standing there, strangers weighing you like cattle, your future in their beds. The custom thrived especially in Yorkshire, where nearly a third of documented sales occurred. In Halifax, 1837, a blacksmith sold his wife for 1 shilling, bought her back, then sold her again to a married man. When she learned of it, she beat her husband bloody. Consent was far from universal. In Goole, 1849, a man tracked his runaway wife and her lover, then staged a sale in the square. She sold for 5 shillings and 9 pence, and before leaving with her new partner, mocked her ex. "There, good for naught, that's more than you would fetch." Even children were sometimes sold with their mothers, priced as though they were livestock themselves. In 1865, a woman and 2 children went for £100 plus £25 each, years of wages in one transaction. The law's response was muddled. Wife selling had no legal basis. It was essentially adultery followed by bigamy. Yet many magistrates hesitated to interfere. In 1819, when one tried to stop a sale in Derby, the crowd pelted him with refuse and drove him away. He later admitted he wasn't sure he had the right to stop it, since it was a custom of the people. At times, officials even encouraged it. Poor law commissioners, eager to avoid supporting destitute families, sometimes forced husbands to sell their wives instead. In 1814, Henry Cook was compelled by workhouse authorities to auction his wife at Cudden Market for 1 shilling, the parish even paying for the journey and the wedding meal. Markets themselves held symbolic weight. They were places of trade, where property changed hands. By staging sales there, participants demanded the community bear witness, creating legitimacy where the law refused it. The halter said the rest plainly. Wives were livestock, property, goods to be passed from man to man. By the 1840s, the practice began to fade. Attitudes shifted. Newspapers called the scenes disgraceful. Middle-class reformers condemned them as proof of working-class depravity. More sales moved behind closed doors, deeds replacing auctions. Evangelical groups like the Salvation Army railed against the custom, though irony struck in 1889, when one of their own members sold his wife for 1 shilling in Nottinghamshire. By then, desperation still drove some couples to cling to the ritual, even as society recoiled. The final recorded sale came in 1913, when a woman testified in Leeds police court that she'd been sold to her husband's workmate for £1. It was no longer accepted custom, just relic and shame. But the deeper horror of wife selling wasn't the spectacle itself. It was what it revealed about the world that made it possible. These weren't savages. They were ordinary men and women trapped in a cruel legal system that denied them dignity, denied them escape, denied them humanity. When the law gives no remedy, people will invent one, however grotesque. The women who stood in those market squares, halters biting their skin, were not just victims of cruel husbands. They were victims of a society that erased them. They endured humiliation because it offered a chance at survival, a chance at change. For a few shillings and the price of their pride, they stepped out of one cage and into another, praying the next one might feel a little less like chains, being treated as a transaction rather than a person. The crowds who gathered for these auctions weren't just thrill-seeking spectators, though spectacle was part of the draw. They stood as witnesses to a community's attempt to solve problems that law either ignored or refused to touch. It was rough justice made public, forcing hidden struggles into view. Arthur Muni described what he called the fine old custom. In a North Yorkshire village in February 1860, an elderly man sold his far younger wife to a middle-aged buyer for 18 pence. The purchaser had convinced himself the deal was proper and legal, but the village thought otherwise. They burned effigies of the pair on the green, making clear that even in places where wife-selling survived, it remained morally fraught and socially divisive. The practice cut across class lines more than Victorian commentators wanted to acknowledge. The Duke of Chandos supposedly acquired his second wife from an innkeeper around 1740, paying half a crown for a woman being abused. He later educated her, married her after her first husband's death, and by accounts they lived happily. On her deathbed, she confessed her past and urged her household to trust in Providence. Her story suggests that even aristocratic wife-selling could grow into mutual respect. These accounts complicate what the custom meant for those involved. Yes, it was degrading. Yes, it reduced women to property. But it also twisted, as it seems, offered an escape. It opened a door from marriages that might otherwise have meant lifelong misery or even death. Records reveal that many wives helped arrange their own sales. In Plymouth in 1822, a woman funded the purchase of her own freedom through an agent. In many cases, wives pushed for the sales when husbands reconsidered. They weren't simply dragged like cattle, they were participants using the only form of divorce accessible to them. That doesn't erase the cruelty, but it explains why the custom endured for over 2 centuries. Wife-selling wasn't only about men discarding wives, it was families clawing for solutions with the meager tools available. The broader setting makes it even more tragic. A working man earned perhaps 10 shillings a week. Families crowded into single rooms without water. Children barely 6 labored 12-hour days in factories. Life was short, merciless, and offered few choices. For the poor, marriage wasn't romantic but economic. When that arrangement collapsed, when wages vanished into ale, when infertility broke families, when violence poisoned the home, there was no safety net. Churches offered sermons but no solutions. Courts offered punishment but no mercy. Only the brutal spectacle of wife-selling offered an escape route. Newspaper reports, written mostly by middle-class journalists for middle-class readers, dripped with condescension and disgust. They painted participants as crude, the crowds as savage, yet hidden between the lines are stories of desperate people making unbearable choices, with as much dignity as they could summon. From today's vantage point, it's easy to fixate on the cruelty. A woman with a rope around her neck, auctioned like an animal, is a powerful symbol of oppression. But it was also something more, a community's attempt to carve out justice where law left nothing. It was a grim way to claim agency inside a system built to deny choice. It was harsh, imperfect, and cruel. But for the poor it was the only escape from ruin. The custom faded not because society woke to women's rights, but because divorce law loosened slightly, and economic shifts gave women other options. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1880 chipped away at coverture, letting wives keep earnings and inherit. Achingly slowly, the law recognized women as individuals rather than property. But for the women who stood in market squares with halters at their throats, these reforms came too late. They lived in a world where their wages weren't their own, where their identity was swallowed by marriage, where no escape from misery existed outside the degrading ritual of public sale. Their stories remind us progress isn't guaranteed. The rights we take for granted were fought for at immense cost. They remind us that when systems fail, people invent their own versions of justice, however brutal. As you sit with your modern freedoms, the right to divorce, the right to own property, the recognition of full personhood, remember the women who paid for their freedom with shillings and humiliation. Remember that those rights were built on suffering. The market square auctions are gone, but they leave behind uneasy questions about the systems we still live under, and those they still fail. Behind every grotesque custom are human stories of endurance, desperation, and the search for a better life even when the cost was unbearable. The horror becomes sharper when we look at the mechanics of these auctions. Picture yourself in that market square, not in theory but in flesh. The morning mist clings to the cobbles, and the air smells of hay, dung, and the sharp tang of iron. But today the fear isn't from livestock, it's human. On the platform isn't an ox or a horse but a woman. She could be Elizabeth, Sarah, or Mary, names lost except in yellowed newsprint. She's 28, with hands scarred from work, her once pretty face hardened by poverty. Round her neck is a halter, thick rope meant for horses, rubbing raw against her skin. Her husband grips the other end with ale-shaken fingers, his voice rising above the crowd. "Come now, gentlemen, what'll you give for this fine woman? Strong as an ox, works 16 hours without complaint, teeth all sound, her lips are torn apart by his grip, her teeth displayed like those of a creature for sale. Men press closer, not monsters but laborers judging worth. They study her calluses, her hips, her face. A blacksmith prods her arm. Thin, he says, might not last the winter. What's her temper? The husband answers smoothly, sweet as a lamb, never raises her voice, good with children. But her eyes betray the lie. There's defiance there, calculation. She clenches her fists, lips tight. She isn't simply a victim, she is playing a role in a grim drama that might be her only escape. Bidding begins. 2 shillings, a cattle dealer calls, half jest. Laughter follows. 2 and 6, a young farmer blurts, cheeks red. Perhaps 25, awkward, eager, thinking he's found an instant wife. The woman studies him. Does he drink? Does he beat? Will life with him be worse than what she's fleeing? Then, 3 shillings, a voice at the back. Thomas Miller, widower, the man she's secretly met for months. Relief flashes in her face, seen by the crowd. This is theater, a staged sale to legitimize an arrangement already made. But the young farmer doesn't see the script. 4 shillings, he calls, and I'll throw in a pig. The woman stiffens. This wasn't planned. Thomas frowns. 5 shillings, the farmer counters. 6, the crowd, entertained, leans in. The husband, drunk and greedy, starts calculating how much ale 6 shillings will buy. Panic flickers in the woman's eyes. She could end up with a stranger, someone crueler than the husband she's leaving. 7, Thomas pushes, teeth clenched. It's more than he can afford, but he sees her fear. The farmer hesitates. 7 and a pig is too steep. He looks again at her face and reads the truth. Fear, not welcome. 7 and 6, he mutters, but his voice falters. The husband, sensing tension, calls, going once for 7 and 6, hoping to end it fast. 8, Thomas cries, desperate, though all know he hasn't the money. Silence hangs heavy. The woman stands between ruin and freedom. Then she speaks. I choose Thomas Miller. Her voice is steady, carrying through the hush. I'll go with him, but I won't be sold to a stranger like a sack of grain. The square erupts. This isn't how it's supposed to work. The woman isn't meant to choose. Yet the dignity in her tone silences dissent. The lass has spoken. An old man shouts, let her go where she wants. The young farmer mutters about bidding highest, but even he sounds relieved. The husband, realizing control is slipping, blurts, 7 shillings from Miller, and she goes willing. Thomas, red-faced, steps forward with borrowed coins. The halter passes from husband to new owner, but Thomas instantly casts it aside, freeing her neck. The crowd claps as if they've witnessed a play reach its rightful end. A dramatic performance reaches its close. The woman lets call her Sarah curtsies to the crowd with more dignity than anyone there deserves. She takes Thomas Miller's arm, but as the crowd drifts away, the cost of this so-called happy ending becomes clear. Sarah may have escaped one bad life, but she is now legally bound to Thomas Miller as tightly as she was to her first husband. If Thomas turns cruel or drinks himself into rage, she'll have no more protection than before. She has traded one form of bondage for another, hoping her new master proves gentler than the old. The young farmer who nearly bought her watches with unsettled thoughts. Part of him is disappointed. Loneliness had pushed him into believing a purchased wife could mend his life. Yet part of him is disturbed. He's never truly considered what it would mean to own another human being, someone tied to him not by love, nor even by mutual gain, but by a legal illusion that stripped her down to property. Sarah's husband, her former husband, now clutches his 7 shillings and heads for the nearest tavern, already weighing how many mugs of ale it might buy. He feels both relief and loss he can't name. Sarah had been a burden, yes, one more mouth to feed, one more voice asking for more than he could provide. But she had also been the only person alive who noticed if he lived or died, even if that notice came with fear and bitterness. This scene may be imagined, but it is stitched together from dozens of real cases that followed almost identical patterns. Wife selling was never just the crude tale of a man discarding a wife. It was far messier, far sadder. Take Marion Price, sold in Merthyr Tydfil in 1837. Newspapers described her as young and attractive, with a rope tied at her waist. She went to a man named Lewis for 4 shillings and 6 pence. The sale, however, had clearly been arranged. Lewis was her sweetheart, and everyone present seemed satisfied. Yet details buried in the report hint at more. Her husband was a collier, a coal miner ruined by drink. The region itself was crushed by depression, families starving on broken wages. For Marianne, This sale may have been the choice between slow ruin with a drunkard, or survival with someone who could feed her. Or consider Carlisle, 1832. A wife stood for sale, but refused every bidder. The crowd grew restless, then angry, until a magistrate intervened to prevent bloodshed. Eventually she was struck off to a man she had never met, for 3 shillings, but she refused to leave with him. The deal was voided. She returned to her husband. History does not tell us what came next. Cases like these reveal the contradiction of wife selling. It leaned on the fiction that women were property to be transferred, yet it also leaned on consent at least enough to satisfy the crowd. A woman clearly forced into sale drew sympathy, sometimes intervention. Patterns in geography reveal more. Yorkshire, with both factories and rural poverty, saw the most sales. The wealthier south saw fewer. Scotland, with different laws, almost none. In the industrial north, where economic upheaval shattered traditional family structures, wife selling acted as a crude adaptation. Factory life meant couples no longer labored together. Schedules, wages, and social circles divided them. When marriages failed, older community remedies vanished. Wife selling stepped into the gap. The halter, usually a rope or strap, tied the ritual to livestock trading, but it also served a legal function. English common law recognized transfer through the physical handling of goods, called livery of seisin. Dating back centuries, the halter made the sale feel legitimate. Psychologically, too, it mattered. For sellers, it confirmed what the law implied, that wives were property. For buyers, it marked ownership. For the women, the moment the halter was removed often marked the shift from one household to another. Some sales grew elaborate, with multiple transfers. Sheffield, 1842. A woman was sold 3 times in one day. Each time, men bid, examined her, then backed out. She stood on the block again and again, until finally breaking down in tears. Multiple sales like this revealed the system's instability. With no legal footing, contracts could collapse at any moment. A buyer could change his mind. A woman could beg for another transfer. There was no law to bind either side. Children suffered most. Some were included in the bargain, like goods attached to the main lot. In Pontefract, 1847, a woman and her 3 children were sold together, the buyer agreeing to raise them. More often, children were left behind with fathers, separated from their mothers forever. The records are silent on their feelings, but we can imagine the horror of watching your mother led away by a rope in the hands of a stranger. Sales drew crowds, hundreds, sometimes thousands. For many, they were entertainment, yet they also served as public debate. What was acceptable? What was cruel? What was fair? The audience was not passive. They cheered, jeered, even intervened. A husband trying to sell his wife to a despised buyer might find the deal broken by the mob. Community approval was required, and approval came only if unspoken rules of fairness and consent were met. By the mid-1800s, attitudes began to shift. A rising middle class, obsessed with privacy and respectability, found such spectacles shameful. Newspapers began calling them disgusting exhibitions. Preachers thundered against them as sinful. Courts stiffened sentences. By the 1860s, 6 months in jail was possible, yet prosecutions were rare. Proof was hard. Participants denied money changed hands, and juries often sympathized with those trying to solve hopeless problems. Even as the practice faded, it lived on in culture. Music hall songs mocked wife selling, turning it into farce. Husbands as fools, wives as nagging shrews, buyers as dupes. The reality, the desperation, was buried under laughter, yet its persistence in popular stories showed the fears it reflected. Marriage as bargain, women as property, homes broken and remade. The practice traveled, too. English settlers brought it to America, where records from Connecticut to South Carolina show cases. In some places it was even more formalized, with written bills of sale. French observers relished reports of it, mocking English barbarism in political cartoons. For British elites trying to claim moral leadership in Europe, such ridicule was humiliating. Pressure mounted to end it. Drink was never far away. Many sales began in taverns, fueled by ale and male bravado. Drinking together afterward helped make the act seem less brutal. Husbands who sold wives drunk sometimes tried to reclaim them sober, but courts rarely allowed it. A sale was a sale. Economics were at the core. Marriage was survival. Women needed protection. Men needed labor. When partnerships failed, wife selling redistributed resources. Prices reflected skill, fertility, even health. Newspapers recorded these details, preserving glimpses of working-class life otherwise lost. There were rules, proper markets, proper payments. To break them invited disapproval or violence. By the mid-19th century, economic change eroded the need. Factory work gave women wages, cities offered escape, trains allowed flight. Romantic ideals made marriage about love, not commerce. Divorce laws still costly slowly opened. By the early 20th century, wife selling was a relic. A murky case in 1913 Leeds drew only scorn, no crowd. Its legacy, however, lingers. Wife selling exposes how systems fail when law does not meet human need. It shows how desperate people turn to desperate customs. The women involved were not only victims. Many acted with agency, choosing what seemed the least terrible option. The question it leaves us is haunting. What happens when legal systems fail to protect the vulnerable? The echoes are clear in abuse cases, in undocumented workers, in families crushed by economic policy. And so, we return to that market square. A woman with a rope around her neck, strangers bidding on her body and her future. Some women found kindness in new arrangements. Others learned nothing changed but the face of their master. All bore scars no comfort could erase. Progress is not inevitable. The rights we enjoy were bought with the pain of those who had none. The halters may be gone, the markets replaced with shops, but the questions remain. How do we build systems that protect people, not just principles? How do we ensure dignity is not the privilege of the few? The women who endured wife sales deserve to be remembered not simply as relics of cruelty, but as human beings who endured impossible circumstances with courage. Their stories remind us that freedom is fragile, justice unfinished, and vigilance eternal. The squares are empty now, but the questions they raised about human worth, law, survival are as urgent today as 2 centuries ago.